August 1915. Thousands of young men packed into crowded trains heading toward the front lines of World War I. Some laughed. Some smoked nervously. Others sang patriotic songs to hide their fear. The 17-year-old recruit sat quietly near the window. He had lied about his age to join the army. Back home, he imagined war would make him a hero. But as the train rolled deeper into France, the atmosphere slowly changed. The soldiers stopped singing. Outside the windows, villages appeared abandoned. Churches stood shattered. Fields were ripped apart by artillery craters. Then the train slowed. A wounded soldier stood beside the tracks watching them pass. One arm was missing. His face was wrapped in blood-stained bandages. Nobody inside the train spoke. For the first time, the teenager realized something terrifying. This was not an adventure. This was a slaughter. The train stopped near midnight. Cold rain poured onto the exhausted recruits as steam hissed into the freezing air. Nobody sang anymore. Nobody even spoke. The 17-year-old stepped down from the train and into ankle-deep mud. His boots immediately sank into the road beneath him. Far ahead, orange flashes lit the clouds every few seconds. Artillery. A few moments later, the explosions reached them. Deep thunder rolled across the countryside and shook the ground beneath their feet. The recruits silently followed the officers into the darkness. The deeper they marched toward the front, the worse everything became. Broken wagons lined the roadside. Trees had been ripped apart by shellfire. Telephone poles leaned sideways like skeletons in the mud. Then came the smell. Rotting horses, smoke, wet earth, death. The teenager pulled his coat over his mouth, but it changed nothing. Rainwater dripped from his helmet as the column kept moving forward. Then they passed the wounded. Dozens of soldiers sat beside the road waiting for transport away from the front line. Some stared blankly into the darkness. Others trembled uncontrollably beneath blood-stained blankets. One soldier rocked back and forth, whispering quietly to himself, "I want to go home." Again and again. "I need to go home." The teenager looked away and kept marching, but the sounds of war only grew louder. Machine guns rattled endlessly somewhere ahead. Artillery shells screamed through the night sky before exploding in the distance. Every blast briefly lit the clouds above them. Then suddenly, the soldiers ahead stopped walking. Lightning flashed across the sky. And for one horrifying second, the teenager finally saw the trenches. A massive scar carved through the earth. Endless mud, barbed wire, and shadowy figures disappearing into the darkness below. The teenager climbed down into the trench slowly. Mud swallowed his boots instantly. The walls were made from rotting wood, wet earth, and sandbags ripped apart by shellfire. Water dripped constantly from above. The trench smelled unbearable. Mud, smoke, human waste, and something far worse, death. Soldiers squeezed past each other silently in the narrow passageways. Most looked exhausted beyond words. Their uniforms were soaked black with rain and filth. Some had not shaved in weeks. Others stared into nothing as if part of them had already died here. The teenager tried not to show fear, but his hands would not stop shaking. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed in agony, calling a medic. The cry echoed through the trench before suddenly stopping. Nobody reacted. The soldiers around him barely even looked up, as if they had heard it 1,000 times before. A rat the size of a cat crawled across the trench boards beside his feet. Another disappeared into the darkness carrying scraps of food, or something worse. The teenager looked up toward the top of the trench. Barbed wire stretched endlessly across the battlefield outside. Beyond it, no man's land. A frozen wasteland of mud, craters, corpses, and shattered trees. Lightning flashed across the sky. For a split second, he saw bodies tangled in the wire. Some had been there so long their uniforms barely looked human anymore. The teenager quickly looked away. An older soldier noticed his expression and laughed quietly. "First night." The teenager nodded. The older soldier lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "If the shells start landing, pray they kill you fast." Before the teenager could answer, a deafening explosion shook the trench. Mud rained down from above. Another explosion followed instantly after. Then another. The artillery barrage had begun. The trench erupted into chaos. Men scrambled for cover. Lanterns swung violently in the darkness. Officers shouted over the explosions. The teenager pressed himself against the trench wall as the earth shook around him. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying. Another soldier prayed loudly beneath the thunder of the shells. Then came a scream unlike anything he had ever heard before. A section of trench collapsed nearby. Several soldiers disappeared beneath the mud. The teenager could still hear them screaming underneath the earth, begging for help. Nobody moved. Nobody could. The shelling only grew louder. And in that moment, the 17-year-old finally understood the truth. This place was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled. The shelling finally stopped just before dawn. Silence spread slowly across the trench. Not peaceful silence, the kind that comes after something terrible. Smoke drifted through the cold morning air. The teenager carefully lifted his head from the trench wall. Mud covered his uniform completely now. His ears still rang from the explosions. Around him, exhausted soldiers slowly emerged from the darkness. Some looked pale and shaken. Others simply stared ahead without speaking. One man sat motionless beside the trench wall covered in dirt and blood. The teenager realized the soldier was dead only when another man quietly pulled the rifle from his hands. Nobody said anything. There was no time. A whistle blew somewhere down the trench. It was time. Instantly, the trench came alive again. Soldiers grabbed rifles and climbed onto firing steps beneath the gray morning sky. The teenager copied the others quickly. His hands trembled as he pulled himself high enough to look over the top of the trench for the very first time. No man's land stretched endlessly ahead, a wasteland of mud and craters. Barbed wire twisted across the battlefield like giant thorns. Dead trees stood black against the morning fog. And everywhere, bodies. Some lay face down in the mud. Others hung tangled in the wire where they had died trying to cross. Crows picked at the remains beneath the cold morning light. The teenager felt his stomach twist. Then movement appeared through the fog ahead. Far across no man's land, shadowy figures moved between the smoke and craters. German soldiers. The teenager froze. For one brief moment, one of the enemy soldiers stopped and stared directly toward the trench. Two terrified boys standing on opposite sides of hell. Then artillery thundered again somewhere in the distance. The figure disappeared back into the fog. An older soldier beside the teenager lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. Get used to it. You're one of us now. The teenager looked back across the battlefield. The bodies, the wire, the endless mud, and deep down, he realized something horrifying. If he stayed here long enough, nobody back home would ever recognize him again. The morning passed slowly, too slowly. The teenager remained crouched inside the trench while distant artillery rumbled across the front line. Every few minutes, another shell exploded somewhere beyond the fog. Nobody relaxed. Nobody joked anymore. The older soldiers simply waited, as if they already knew what was coming. Rainwater dripped steadily from the trench walls. Mud covered everything. Rifles, boots, hands, faces. Even breathing felt heavy inside the freezing trench air. Then suddenly, a whistle shrieked somewhere down the line. Every soldier instantly looked up. The officer climbed onto the firing step and screamed the words nobody wanted to hear. "Prepare to advance!" Fear spread across the trench immediately. Some soldiers checked their rifles with trembling hands. Others whispered prayers beneath their breath. One young recruit looked physically sick. The teenager felt his chest tighten so hard he could barely breathe. This was it, the moment he had imagined 1,000 times back home. But now that it was real, he wanted to run. Another whistle blast echoed through the trench. Ladders were pushed against the trench walls. Soldiers climbed upward one by one toward the smoke and gunfire above. The older soldier beside the teenager grabbed his shoulder tightly. "Stay low, and don't stop moving." Then he disappeared over the top. The teenager stared upward toward the gray sky above the trench. Machine gun fire rattled violently across no man's land. Screams echoed somewhere ahead. Another soldier climbed out. Then another. The officer turned toward the teenager. "Move." His legs felt frozen. But somehow he climbed. His hands gripped the muddy ladder tightly as artillery thundered around him. Then finally, he pulled himself over the top. The battlefield stretched endlessly ahead beneath smoke and fog. Bodies lay everywhere across the mud. Barbed wire twisted through craters filled with rainwater and blood. And ahead, German machine guns opened fire. Soldiers immediately began falling around him. One man beside the teenager collapsed instantly before he had even taken 3 steps. Another screamed while clutching his stomach. The teenager ran blindly through the mud as bullets snapped through the air around his head. This was no heroic charge. This was slaughter. And for the first time since arriving at the front, the 17-year-old truly believed he was going to die. The teenager kept running. Mud exploded beneath his boots as machine gun fire ripped across the battlefield. He could barely hear anything now except explosions and screaming. Smoke swallowed the battlefield completely. Men disappeared inside it. Some never came back out. A soldier ahead suddenly vanished into a crater filled with muddy water. Another stumbled through the wire before collapsing face first into the blood-soaked earth. The teenager kept moving. He didn't even know where he was running anymore. Then something slammed into him. Hard. He crashed violently into the mud. For a second, he thought he had been shot. But when he looked up, Another soldier had fallen directly on top of him. The man's helmet rolled away into the crater beside them. Blood poured through his torn uniform. The soldier gasped desperately for air. Then slowly, he stopped moving. The teenager stared at the body, frozen in shock. The dead soldier looked barely older than him. Maybe 18, maybe younger. Artillery thundered again nearby. Mud rained down across the crater. The teenager forced himself back onto his feet. Around him, the attack had completely fallen apart. Bodies covered the battlefield. Some soldiers crawled desperately through the mud searching for cover. Others screamed for medics that would never reach them in time. And ahead, the German machine gun still fired without stopping. The teenager finally understood the truth. This was not bravery. This was survival. And survival meant becoming someone else. Someone colder. Someone numb. The frightened boy who boarded the train only yesterday was already disappearing. The teenager slowly looked back toward the trench through the smoke behind him. Then he realized something horrifying. It had only been 24 hours.